The sky over Millfield, Kansas had turned the color of old pennies, copper green and threatening, when Clara Reyes stepped off the Greyhound bus with nothing but a worn leather satchel and a photograph of a man she'd never met. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind whipped her dark hair across her face as she clutched the crumpled paper with an address scrawled in Victor Ashford's careful handwriting. 3 months of correspondence through a marriage agency had led to this moment, standing on cracked asphalt in a town that looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. She traveled 2,000 miles from Tegucigalpa, trading the familiar chaos of Honduran streets for the endless wheat fields of Kansas, all for the promise of a new life. The teaching degree she'd earned meant nothing here without perfect English, and the factory jobs paid barely enough to survive. Victor's letters had painted pictures of stability, of a ranch house with room to breathe, of children she could teach, and a garden she could tend. He'd promised her safety in a country where safety felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. The bus driver tossed her single suitcase onto the sidewalk with barely a glance. Clara picked it up, feeling the weight of everything she owned, everything she was, condensed into 30 pounds of fabric and hope. The depot was little more than a concrete bench and a rusted sign. But across the street stood the Copper Kettle Diner, its neon sign flickering against the darkening sky. Marcus Holloway was chasing his third supercell of the week when he saw her standing there, a small figure in a yellow dress that seemed to glow against the storm-dark sky. He'd been tracking the system for hours, watching the rotation signatures on his mobile radar unit, calculating wind speeds and trajectory paths. The storm was building into something magnificent and terrifying, the kind that made headlines and changed landscapes forever. Mac pulled his reinforced pickup truck into the diner's parking lot, his equipment-laden trailer rattling behind him. He'd been doing this for 8 years now, ever since the tornado that took his research partner and nearly ended his career. These days, he worked alone, funded by a university grant that barely covered gas money, living in a converted trailer that could withstand winds up to 160 miles per hour. His colleagues called him reckless. His family had stopped calling at all. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he watched the woman struggle with her suitcase as the wind tried to tear it from her hands. She was looking around like she expected someone to meet her, but the streets were empty except for a few cars whose owners had enough sense to stay indoors. Mac glanced at his weather instruments. The storm was still 20 minutes out, but the conditions were deteriorating fast. He grabbed his yellow rain slicker and jogged across the street. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25, with intelligent brown eyes that held a mixture of determination and barely controlled fear. Not fear of the storm, though. Fear of something else entirely. "Ma'am, you need to get inside," he called over the rising wind. "There's a tornado warning for this county." She looked at him blankly for a moment, then shook her head. "I wait for someone. Victor Ashford. You know this man?" Her accent was musical, Spanish inflections softening the harsh Kansas consonants. Mac knew the name all right. Victor Ashford owned half the county, including the bank that held mortgages on the other half. He was also married to a woman he'd brought back from a business trip to Dallas 5 years ago, though that detail apparently hadn't made it into whatever correspondence had brought this young woman to Millfield. "Victor's not coming," Mac said gently. "Not tonight. Maybe not at all." The first marble-sized hailstone struck the pavement between them with a sharp crack. Within seconds, the sky opened up, dumping ice and rain with the fury of something. Alive and angry, Mac grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her toward the diner as hail pounded their shoulders and backs. She clutched her suitcase with one hand and his jacket with the other, stumbling across the slick asphalt. The copper kettle's bell jangled frantically as they burst through the door, soaked and breathing hard. Beth Garrison looked up from behind the counter, her graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, her expression shifting from mild annoyance to concern as she took in Clara's appearance. "Storm's getting bad out there," Beth said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Y'all better settle in for a while." Mac helped Clara to a booth by the window, noting how she kept glancing toward the door, like she expected it to open at any moment. Her dress was plastered to her slight frame, and she was shivering despite the diner's warmth. He shrugged out of his dry flannel shirt and handed it to her. "Here, put this on before you catch pneumonia." She hesitated, then accepted the shirt with a quiet "gracias." As she pulled it over her dress, Mac caught sight of a faded bruise on her wrist, the yellow-green color of something a few weeks old. His jaw tightened, but he didn't comment. Beth brought over 2 steaming cups of coffee without being asked. "Cream and sugar's on the table, honey," she told Clara kindly. "You look like you could use something warm in your belly." Clara wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into her fingers. "Victor Ashford," she said again, looking between Mac and Beth. "He is supposed to meet me. We have arrangement." Beth's expression grew uncomfortable. She glanced at Mac, who shook his head slightly. This wasn't his story to tell, but someone needed to tell it. "Victor's got a wife," Beth said finally. "Has for years now. Got 3 kids with her too. Whatever arrangement you think you had, well..." The coffee mug trembled in Clara's hands. She set it down carefully, as if it might shatter from her touch. "He said he was alone, widowed. He sent money for bus ticket, for new clothes. I left my job, my family." Outside, the wind howled like something wounded. Mac's portable radio crackled to life with an urgent weather bulletin. "Tornado warning remains in effect for Sumner County until 9 p.m. Doppler radar indicates a large and extremely dangerous tornado approaching from the southwest. Take cover immediately." Mac was on his feet instantly, his storm chaser instincts overriding everything else. Through the diner's large window, he could see the unmistakable wall cloud forming in the distance, a massive rotating column of gray and black that seemed to reach from earth to heaven. The air pressure was dropping so fast, his ears popped. "We need to get to the basement now," he said, but Beth was already moving, years of Kansas living having taught her to read the signs. "Come on, honey," she told Clara, taking her arm. "Storm cellars through the kitchen." Clara stood slowly, still processing the revelation about Victor, still trying to understand how her carefully laid plans had crumbled in the space of a single conversation. Mac grabbed her suitcase with one hand and guided her toward the back of the diner with the other. As they reached the kitchen, the tornado sirens began their haunting wail, a sound that had terrified and fascinated Mac since childhood. The storm cellar was a cramped concrete box beneath the diner's foundation, stocked with emergency supplies and lit by a single bare bulb. Beth had done this dance before. She moved efficiently, checking the radio, making sure the heavy wooden door was secure. Mac helped Clara down the narrow steps, noting how she gripped the handrail with white knuckles. "I have never been in tornado," she whispered, settling onto one of the wooden benches that lined the walls. "First time for everything," Mac said, though he was listening to the sounds above them with professional interest. The freight train roar was building, still distant but approaching fast. This was going to be a big one. The lights flickered and went out. In the darkness, Clara's breathing quickened. Mac found her hand in the blackness and squeezed it gently. Her fingers were cold and trembling. "It's going to be loud," he said quietly, "but we're safe down here. This cellar's survived storms for 40 years. Beth's battery-powered radio provided the only light, its green display showing the time. 8:47 p.m. The tornado was close now, close enough that they could feel it in their bones, in the way the air itself seemed to vibrate with contained violence. Then it hit, The sound was unlike anything Clara had ever experienced, a combination of freight train and jet engine and something primal and wild that spoke to every animal instinct humans had ever possessed. The building above them groaned and creaked as the tornado passed directly overhead, 200-mile-per-hour winds trying to tear apart everything in their path. Clara pressed herself against Mac's side, her face buried in his shoulder. He could feel her whole body shaking. Whether from fear or cold or shock, he couldn't tell. Maybe all three. His arm came up automatically to shield her as debris crashed against the cellar door, as the very foundations of the building shuddered under the storm's assault. The tornado seemed to last forever, and no time at all. 1 minute they were listening to the approaching roar. The next they were sitting in sudden, eerie silence, their ears ringing from the pressure change. Dust sifted down from the ceiling where the building had flexed but held. "Is it over?" Clara whispered. Mac checked his watch. 8:52 p.m. 5 minutes. 5 minutes that had probably changed everything above ground. "The tornado's passed," he said. "But there might be more coming. We should wait a few more minutes." They sat in the darkness, three strangers bound together by survival, listening to the radio reports of destruction across the county. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Millfield had taken a direct hit. Main Street was gone. The school was damaged. Power lines were down across 3 counties. When they finally emerged from the cellar 20 minutes later, Clara's first glimpse of the new world was through the diner's shattered windows. Where the Ashford ranch had stood on the hill east of town, there was nothing but empty foundation and scattered debris. The tornado had carved a path of destruction 1/4 mile wide and 8 miles long, erasing parts of Millfield as completely as if they had never existed. Clara stared at the devastation, her suitcase still clutched in one hand. Mac's flannel shirt still wrapped around her shoulders. In the space of an hour, she'd discovered her future was a lie and watched a natural disaster reshape the landscape around her. She was stranded in a town she'd never seen before, with no money, no contacts, and nowhere to go. "Victor's ranch is gone," she said quietly, stating the obvious because sometimes the obvious was all that made sense. Mac nodded, surveying the damage with a professional eye. He'd seen dozens of tornado paths, had documented the aftermath of nature's most violent storms, but this felt different. This felt personal. Maybe because of the woman standing beside him, clutching the remains of a dream that had been built on lies. "What will you do now?" he asked. Clara was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the destruction, at the emergency vehicles beginning to arrive from neighboring counties, at the people emerging from their hiding places to assess what they'd lost. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite everything. "I do not know, but I will not go back." There was something in the way she said it, a finality that told Mac this wasn't just about Victor or the tornado or even the destroyed ranch. This was about something bigger, something that had driven her 2,000 miles from home to take a chance on a stranger's promise. Whatever she was running from, it was worse than being stranded in a disaster zone with nothing but the clothes on her back. As the first emergency responders reached the diner, as Beth began the grim task of documenting what remained of her life's work, Mac made a decision that surprised him as much as it would have surprised anyone who knew him. For 8 years, he'd lived alone, worked alone, trusted no one with his research or his life. He'd built walls as strong as the reinforced trailer he called home. Walls designed to keep out the kind of pain that came from caring about someone else's survival. But looking at Clara in the aftermath of the storm, seeing the quiet determination in her eyes, despite everything that had been taken from her in a single evening, he felt something crack open in his chest. Something that had been locked away. Since the day he'd watched his research partner disappear into an F4 tornado because Mac had miscalculated the storm's path. "You can stay with me," he said quietly, "just until you figure out what comes next." Clara turned to look at him, really. Look at him for the first time since they'd met in the parking lot an hour and a lifetime ago. She saw a man in his mid-30s with weathered hands and kind eyes, someone who understood storms from the inside out, someone who'd offered shelter to a stranger without asking for anything in return. "Why?" she asked simply. Mac glanced around at the destruction, at the emergency lights flashing in the distance, at the town of Millfield beginning the long process of putting itself back together. "Because sometimes the storm brings exactly what you need," he said, "even if you don't know it at the time." Outside, the winds had died to a whisper, and the first stars were beginning to show through the clearing clouds. The tornado was gone, but its aftermath would reshape everything it had touched. For Clara, standing in the ruins of her carefully planned future, that reshaping was just beginning. She'd come to Kansas looking for safety in a lie. Instead, she'd found something far more dangerous and infinitely more valuable. She'd found the truth, delivered by the wind itself, in the form of a man who chased storms for a living and understood that sometimes the most beautiful things grew from the most devastating destruction. Mac's trailer sat on 40 acres of government, leased land 3 miles south of what used to be Millfield's main district, positioned on a small rise that gave him clear sightlines in all directions. The mobile weather station looked like something between a NASA launch pad and a survivalist's dream, bristling with anemometers, barometric sensors, and satellite dishes that could track storm systems across 3 states. Solar panels gleamed on the reinforced roof, and guy wires anchored the entire structure to concrete footings designed to withstand winds that would flatten conventional buildings. Clara stood beside Mac's truck as he unlocked the heavy steel door, her wet dress clinging to her legs and his flannel shirt hanging loose around her shoulders. The emergency lights from town flickered in the distance like fallen stars, and the air still held that peculiar stillness that followed major storms. She'd never seen anything like the trailer before, this fortress built for one person's war against the sky. "It's not much," Mac said, stepping aside to let her enter first, "but it's solid." The interior surprised her with its efficiency and unexpected warmth. Every surface served multiple purposes. Every item had its designated place. The main living area combined kitchen, dining room, and office, with weather monitoring equipment humming softly along one wall and built-in furniture that could be secured during transport. Books filled every available shelf, not just meteorology texts, but novels, poetry, philosophy. A guitar sat in one corner, its case worn smooth from travel. "You live here always?" Clara asked, setting her suitcase down carefully on the spotless linoleum floor. 8 years now. Bought it after I finished graduate school. Been upgrading it ever since." Mac moved to a control panel and began checking his instruments, fingers dancing across switches with practiced ease. "The university thinks I'm crazy, but this setup lets me get closer to severe weather than any traditional research team." Clara wandered to the window that faced north, toward where Millfield's lights should have been brighter. Instead, she saw mostly darkness punctuated by the occasional emergency vehicle. The town, it will rebuild. Towns always rebuild. Question is whether they rebuild smart or just rebuild fast. Mac pulled 2 bottles of water from a compact refrigerator. "Millfield's been hit before, not this bad, but close. Some folks will take the insurance money and move to Wichita. Others will stay and build stronger." He handed her a water bottle, their fingers brushing briefly. Clara noticed his hands were steady despite everything they'd been through, marked with small scars that suggested a lifetime of working with tools and equipment. Her own hands were shaking slightly, whether from adrenaline or shock or the simple reality of having nowhere to go, she couldn't say. "You study storms for how long?" she asked, settling onto the built-in bench that served as a couch. "Professionally, 10 years, but I've been fascinated by weather since I was a kid growing up in Oklahoma. My grandmother used to take me out on the porch during thunderstorms, teach me to read the clouds, count the seconds between lightning and thunder." Mac's expression softened at the memory. She said, "Storms weren't something to fear if you understood them properly." "And you understand them?" Mac was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I understand their mechanics, how they form, what feeds them, how they move across the landscape. But understanding something and predicting it aren't the same thing. Weather's chaotic by nature. Small changes amplify into enormous consequences." Clara absorbed this, thinking of her own small change, the decision to answer Victor's letter, to leave everything familiar behind. Had she set in motion consequences she couldn't imagine? The tornado certainly felt like one. "In Honduras, we have hurricanes," she said, "but they give you days to prepare. This tornado, it comes so fast." Tornadoes are different animals. They're born from the marriage of different air masses, hot and cold, dry and humid. The Great Plains are perfect for them because there's nothing to break up the wind patterns, no mountains or forests to disrupt the flow. It's like nature designed this part of the country specifically to grow supercells. Mac moved to his weather station, checking the latest satellite data on multiple screens. "We're in a lull now, but there's another system developing over Colorado. Could reach us by tomorrow afternoon." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with her damp clothes. More tornadoes. Possibly. Spring in Kansas is tornado season. We could see a dozen systems pass through before summer. He glanced at her, noting her expression. "Don't worry. This trailer's been through worse than what hit town tonight." The confidence in his voice was reassuring, but Clara was beginning to understand that her problems extended far beyond weather. She had $17 in her purse, no job, no family or friends within 2,000 miles, and the man who was supposed to provide her new life had turned out to be married with children. The tornado had destroyed her destination, but it had been built on quicksand anyway. "Mac," she said quietly, "why did you help me tonight?" He turned from his instruments to look at her directly. In the soft glow of the equipment lights, his face was thoughtful, almost studious. "Because you needed help, and because I know what it's like to have your plans destroyed by forces beyond your control." "You have been in tornado?" "In a way." Mac settled into the chair across from her, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his hair was starting to show gray at the temples. 3 years ago, I was part of a research team studying a massive supercell in Oklahoma. My partner, David, was the best meteorologist I've ever worked with. We'd been tracking this storm for hours, thought we had its path calculated perfectly. His voice grew quieter, more distant. David wanted to deploy sensors directly in the tornado's path, get readings from inside the vortex. I ran the numbers twice, triple-checked the trajectory. Everything said we had 15 minutes of safety margin. Clara waited, sensing this was a story Mac didn't tell often. The storm changed course, subtle shift in the upper-level winds, something I should have caught but didn't. David was placing the last sensor when the tornado turned toward him. I was too far away to help, too far to even warn him properly. Mac's hands clenched and unclenched in his lap. He disappeared into an F4 tornado because I miscalculated by 3 degrees and 2 minutes. That is why you work alone now. That's why I work alone now. Mac stood and moved back to his weather station, needing the familiar comfort of data and instruments. The university wanted to shut down our mobile research program after the accident. Too dangerous, they said, too unpredictable. But someone needs to understand these storms better, get close enough to really study them. Someone needs to push the boundaries of what we know. Clara rose and joined him at the equipment wall, studying the screens full of numbers and colored patterns that meant nothing to her, but clearly told Mac entire stories about the sky. And you think understanding will prevent more accidents? I think understanding is the only way to live with something that powerful. You can't control weather, but you can learn to read its moods, anticipate its movements. Sometimes that's enough to save lives. She was quiet for several minutes, watching him work with instruments she couldn't begin to identify. His movements were precise, economical, the gestures of someone who'd performed these tasks thousands of times. There was something meditative about his focus, a peace that came from having a purpose larger than himself. In Honduras, Clara said eventually, I taught children in a school that had no books, no supplies, barely enough desks for half the students. But I taught them anyway because they needed to learn, needed to believe there was something better waiting for them if they worked hard enough. Mac looked up from his calculations. That is why I answered Victor's letter. Not because I believed in fairy tales about rich American men, but because I needed to believe there was something better waiting for me too, even if it meant taking a chance on a stranger's promise. And now? Clara gestured toward the window, toward the darkness where a town was trying to piece itself back together. Now I know the stranger was lying, but maybe the chance was real anyway. Maybe it just looked different than I expected. Mac studied her face in the glow of the monitoring equipment. There was something remarkable about her composure. The way she'd absorbed blow after blow throughout the evening and still managed to find her footing. Most people would be in tears or panic by now, but Clara seemed to be assessing her situation with the same calm focus he brought to studying weather. Patterns. You can stay here as long as you need, he said. I meant what I said at the diner. No strings attached, no expectations. Just a safe place to figure out your next move. And what about your research? Your need to work alone? Mac was quiet, here for a moment, considering this. Maybe working alone was about avoiding responsibility for someone else's safety, but you've already survived a direct tornado hit. I'm not sure there's much I could do to put you in more danger than you've already faced. Clara smiled at this, the first real smile Mac had seen from her all evening. It transformed her face, bringing warmth to her dark eyes and softening the worried lines around her mouth. So I am safe because I am already dangerous. Something like that. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the quiet hum of Mac's equipment and the distant sounds of emergency responders working through the night. Clara found herself studying his profile as he made notes on a weather chart, noting the concentration in his expression, the careful way he cross-referenced multiple data sources before drawing any conclusions. May I ask you something? She said, of course. Before tonight, when did you last have someone stay here with you? Mac's pen paused over the chart. Never. I mean, colleagues have visited during research deployments, but no one's ever actually stayed overnight. This trailer's designed for one person. Then where will you sleep? There's a fold-out bed behind that panel. Mac gestured toward what looked like a blank wall. I'll take that. You can have the main bed. It's more comfortable. Clara shook her head. I cannot take your bed. You have already done too much. You're not taking anything. I'm offering... There's a difference. The firmness in his voice brooked no argument, but Clara wasn't used to accepting charity without providing something in return. In her experience, help always came with a price, even when the price wasn't named up front. Then let me cook for you, she said. I see you have kitchen. I can make real food, not just sandwiches and canned soup. Mac looked around at his compact cooking area, trying to remember what supplies he actually had on hand. Most of his meals came from diners and convenience stores, quick fuel for a lifestyle that rarely stayed in one place long enough for proper cooking. "I don't have much in the way of ingredients. Show me what you have. I will make something. Good." For the next 20 minutes, Clara explored Mac's limited pantry with the determined creativity of someone who'd learned to cook with whatever was available. She found canned tomatoes, dried pasta, a few sad vegetables in the refrigerator, and various spices that Mac had probably forgotten he owned. Her movements in the tiny kitchen were efficient and graceful, economical in the way of people accustomed to working in small spaces. Mac watched her work while pretending to focus on his weather data. There was something soothing about having another person moving through his carefully organized space, adding warmth and life to rooms that had felt like a laboratory more than a home. Clara hummed softly as she chopped onions, a melody he didn't recognize, but found pleasant nonetheless. "You learned to cook from your mother?" he asked. "From my grandmother, mostly. My mother worked long hours at a textile factory, so I spent afternoons with Abuela. She taught me that cooking is not about expensive ingredients. It is about understanding how flavors work together, how to make something beautiful from whatever you have." The pasta sauce was beginning to fill the trailer with rich aromas that made Mac's stomach growl audibly. He couldn't remember the last time his home had smelled like actual cooking rather than reheated takeout. "Your grandmother, is she still in Honduras?" Clara's knife paused over the cutting board. "She died 2 years ago. Cancer. The medical care there, for people like us, it is not." She shrugged, a gesture that conveyed more than words could. "I'm sorry." She was ready, said she had lived long enough to see her grandchildren grown, long enough to know we would be okay without her. "But I think she would have liked to see me settled, maybe with children of my own." Clara resumed, chopping, her movements perhaps a bit more forceful than necessary. "That is part of why Victor's offer seemed so attractive. Not just the money or the security, but the possibility of building the kind of life Abuela wanted for me." Mac watched her face as she spoke, noting the way grief and disappointment tangled together in her expression. "What kind of life did you want for yourself?" Clara considered this while stirring the sauce. "I wanted to teach, real teaching, in a school with books and supplies and students who could focus on learning instead of worrying about whether they would eat that day. I wanted a classroom where children could dream about their futures instead of just surviving their present. You could still teach here. Kansas has schools, needs good teachers." "With my English, with no American credentials?" Clara shook her head. "I am qualified to teach in Honduras, but here I would need to start over completely. New certification, new training, new language skills. It would take years. Years you now have." The simplicity of his statement stopped her stirring. Clara looked at Mac, really looked at him, seeing not just the storm chaser who'd offered her shelter, but a man who understood something about starting over, about rebuilding after everything fell apart. "You think it is possible?" "I think you survived a tornado on your first day in Kansas. After that, teacher certification probably won't seem so impossible." Clara laughed, a sound that surprised both of them with its genuine warmth. "You have a point. Though I am not sure Abuela would have believed her granddaughter would learn about American resilience from a tornado. She might have appreciated the poetry of it. New life born from destruction, strength forged in the storm." The pasta finished cooking as they talked, and Clara drained it with practiced efficiency before combining it with her improvised sauce. The meal was simple but delicious, the kind of comfort food that seemed to reach deeper than mere hunger. They ate at Mac's small table, while rain began to fall again outside, gentle this time, the kind that washed clean rather than destroyed. "This is excellent," Mac said, and meant it. I can't remember the last time I had a home-cooked meal. It is nothing special, just what you had available. Sometimes the best things come from what you have available. Clara met his eyes across the table, understanding that they were no longer talking just about food. Outside, the rain continued its quiet percussion against the trailer's metal roof, and the weather monitoring equipment hummed its electronic lullabies. For the first time since stepping off the bus in Millfield, Clara felt something approaching, peace. But peace, she was learning, was often the calm before the next storm, and in Kansas, there was always another storm coming. Clara woke to the sound of Mac's voice speaking in urgent, clipped tones into a radio headset. Dawn light filtered through the trailer's reinforced windows, revealing a landscape transformed by the previous night's violence. Where yesterday there had been orderly farm fields and scattered buildings, now debris fields stretched in every direction, creating abstract patterns of destruction that seemed almost artistic from a distance. She found Mac hunched over his weather station, multiple screens displaying satellite imagery and radar data that painted an ominous picture across the Central Plains. His hair was disheveled, suggesting he hadn't slept much, and there were fresh coffee stains on his shirt from what appeared to be his third or fourth cup of the morning. "How bad?" she asked quietly, not wanting to interrupt his radio conversation, but needing to understand what had drawn the worry lines around his eyes. Mac held up one finger, finishing his report to what sounded like a university weather center. "Confirmed. The supercell is maintaining its structure as it moves northeast. ETA to your location, approximately 1400 hours. I'll maintain position and continue updates." He pulled off the headset and turned to face Clara, his expression grim. "There's another system building, bigger than what hit us last night. It's been growing strength over the Oklahoma Panhandle for the past 6 hours, and all the atmospheric conditions are perfect for it to spawn multiple tornadoes." Clara felt her stomach tighten. "Here, it will come here. The projected path has it passing about 20 miles south of us. But storm systems this size can change direction without warning. We need to be prepared for anything." Max stood and moved to a wall cabinet, retrieving what looked like a tactical vest covered in electronic equipment. "I'm going to intercept it, get readings from inside the storm structure." The casual way he said it, like he was discussing a trip to the grocery store, rather than deliberately driving into the path of a potentially deadly weather system, made Clara's breath catch. "You are going to chase it?" "It's what I do. This system has all the characteristics of a truly significant event, maybe an F4 or F5. The data I can collect could help improve warning systems, save lives in future storms." Mac began checking his equipment methodically, each piece clearly having a specific purpose and position. The university has teams positioned at various points, but mobile interceptors can get closer, collect more detailed measurements. Clara watched him prepare with growing unease. The man who had offered her shelter, who had shown her unexpected kindness in the aftermath of disaster, was planning to drive directly into another disaster. "And if the tornado changes direction? If your calculations are wrong again?" Max, hands stilled on his equipment, the reference to his previous miscalculation hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. That's always a risk. But the risk of not understanding these storms is greater than the risk of studying them. Nah, not for you, it isn't. Not if you die in the process. The concern in her voice surprised them both. Clara had known Mac for less than 24 hours, but the thought of him disappearing into a tornado the way his research partner had filled her with a dread that seemed disproportionate to their brief acquaintance. Mac looked at her for a long moment, seeing something in her expression that made him set down his instruments. "I've been doing this for 8 years, Clara. I know how to read storm behavior, how to position myself safely while still collecting useful data. I'm not reckless. Your partner thought he was safe too. The words hit harder than Clara had intended, and she immediately regretted her bluntness. Mac's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might ask her to leave, might decide. That concern from a virtual stranger was more interference than he was willing to tolerate. Instead, he surprised her by sitting down heavily in his desk chair. David was trying to prove something. To himself, to the research community, to everyone who said mobile storm research was too dangerous to be worthwhile. He pushed boundaries that shouldn't have been pushed, took risks that weren't justified by the potential data. And you, what are you trying to prove? Mac was quiet for several minutes, staring at the weather displays without really seeing them. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, that his death meant something. That we can learn from these storms, get better at predicting them, save more lives. That science can make a difference against something as chaotic and powerful as severe weather. Clara moved closer, studying his profile in the morning light. And if you die chasing this storm, what will that prove? It won't come to that. You cannot know that. You said yourself that weather is chaotic, that small changes create enormous consequences. How can you be certain you will not become one of those consequences? Mac turned to face her directly, and Clara saw something in his eyes that went deeper than professional dedication. There was grief there, and guilt, and a kind of desperate need to balance some cosmic equation that had been thrown off kilter 3 years ago. Because I have to be. Because someone has to push forward. To keep trying to understand. If we stop researching severe weather because it's dangerous, if we let fear dictate our response to natural disasters, then we're just victims waiting for the next storm to destroy us. Clara absorbed this, recognizing the logic even as she questioned the wisdom. In Honduras we have a saying, El que no se arriesga no cruza el río. He who doesn't take risks doesn't cross the river. But there is a difference between taking necessary risks and looking for ways to die heroically. I'm not looking to die. Are you looking to live? The question hung between them like a challenge. Mac started to answer quickly, then stopped, realizing that Clara's question went deeper than his immediate survival instincts. She was asking whether he had reasons to return safely, whether his life held value beyond his research, whether he saw himself as more than just a tool for collecting weather data. Before he could formulate a response, his radio crackled to life with an urgent weather bulletin. All stations, this is National Weather Service, Dodge City. We have a tornado emergency in effect for southern Sumner County, multiple tornadoes. On the ground, moving northeast at 35 miles per hour. This is an extremely dangerous situation. Mac was on his feet instantly, his internal debate forgotten in the face of immediate action. The system's accelerating. It's going to be here sooner than projected. He began grabbing equipment with practiced efficiency, loading sensors and recording devices into reinforced cases. I need to get mobile if I'm going to intercept it properly. Clara felt panic rising in her chest, not for herself, but for this man who seemed determined to drive toward danger with the single-minded focus of someone fulfilling a sacred duty. Mac, please stay. Help the people here instead of chasing new storms. The people here need better warning systems, more accurate predictions. That only comes from understanding how these storms behave at close range. The people here need you alive more than they need your data. Mac paused in his preparations, struck by the intensity of Clara's plea. Clara, I appreciate your concern, but this is my job. It's what I've trained for, what I'm good at. I can't just abandon my research because what? Because someone you barely know is asking you to be careful. Clara stepped closer, close enough that he could see the fear and frustration warring in her dark eyes. You are right. We barely know each other, But in one night, you have shown me more kindness than Victor promised in 3 months of letters. You gave me shelter when I had nowhere to go, food when I was hungry, safety when everything around me was falling apart. Mac found himself caught by her words, by the raw honesty in her voice. I do not want to watch another good man disappear into a storm because he thought his duty was more important than his life. I do not want to be alone again so soon after finding someone who understands what it means to start over. The admission hung between them, more revealing than Clara had intended. Mac realized that her concern wasn't just humanitarian worry for a stranger's safety, but something more personal, more immediate. In the space of a single evening, they had begun to matter to each other in ways that defied their brief acquaintance. "Clara," he said gently, "I'm not going to disappear. I'm good at this, I'm careful, and I have every intention of coming back." With data more important than your life? With data that might save other lives? Clara turned away, frustration evident in the set of her shoulders. Through the trailer's windows, she could see the storm clouds building on the horizon, massive towers of vapor that seemed to dwarf the landscape beneath them. Even to her untrained eye, they looked ominous, pregnant with the kind of violence that had reshaped Millfield the night before. "In my country," she said quietly, "we lost many people to Hurricane Mitch, not because we did not know it was coming, but because we had nowhere safe to go, no resources to evacuate, no buildings strong enough to withstand the winds. All the weather prediction in the world could not save people who had no options." Mac listened silently, beginning to understand where her objection was leading. Here, last night, people knew the tornado was coming. They had warnings, sirens, time to take shelter, but they still lost their homes, their businesses, their sense of security. How much more data do you need before you admit that some forces of nature cannot be tamed by understanding them? "Understanding isn't about taming," Mac replied. "It's about adaptation. The more we know about storm behavior, the better we can prepare communities, design stronger buildings, create more effective evacuation procedures. Every piece of data we collect potentially saves lives in future disasters." Clara turned back to face him, her expression softening slightly. "I do not question the value of your work, Mac. I question whether it requires you to risk your life repeatedly to collect it. Are you the only person who can do this research?" "I'm one of the few willing to get close enough to collect meaningful data, or one of the few with so little to lose that the risk seems acceptable." The observation hit closer to home than Mac was comfortable admitting. For 3 years, he had indeed lived as though he had little to lose, throwing himself into increasingly dangerous research deployments with a single-minded focus that bordered on obsessive. His colleagues had begun to worry about his judgment, his safety protocols, his apparent indifference to his own survival. But looking at Clara in the morning light, seeing the genuine concern in her eyes, Mac realized that something had shifted overnight. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking about returning safely, not just as a professional obligation, but as a personal imperative. Someone was waiting for him. Someone who would be affected by his choices. Someone who had reason to hope he would exercise more caution than courage. His radio erupted again with storm updates, pulling him back to the immediate situation. The tornado system was 20 miles out and closing fast, moving with the kind of organized intensity that suggested it would maintain its strength across a wide area. If he was going to intercept it effectively, he needed to leave within the next 30 minutes. "Come with me," he said suddenly, the words surprising him as much as they did Clara. "What?" "Come with me on the intercept. Stay in the truck, well back from the dangerous zones, but come along so you can see what I actually do, how careful I actually am." Mac began gathering additional safety equipment as he spoke. This truck is designed to withstand direct tornado strikes. You'll be safer with me than you would be here alone if the storm changes direction." Clara stared at him as though he had suggested they jump off a cliff together. "You want me to help you chase a tornado? I want you to see that storm research isn't a suicide mission. I want you to understand why this work matters, how it's done safely, what kinds of precautions are actually involved." Mac paused in his preparations to look at her directly. "And I want someone I trust to be there to tell me if I start making the kind of mistakes that got David killed." The request was so unexpected, so contrary to everything Clara had assumed about Mac's solitary approach to his work, that she found herself considering it seriously. The idea of deliberately driving toward a tornado terrified her, but the alternative of staying behind while Mac disappeared into the storm alone seemed even worse. "Your truck, it is really safe. Safer than most buildings. Reinforced frame, bulletproof glass, independent air supply, GPS tracking so rescue teams can find us if something goes wrong. It's basically a mobile bunker designed specifically for severe weather research." Clara walked to the window and looked out at the approaching storm system. The clouds were closer now, dark and roiling with internal energy that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Lightning flickered within the towering cumulus formations, and she could feel the barometric pressure dropping even inside the sealed trailer. "If I come with you," she said slowly, "you will listen if I tell you something is too dangerous. I'll listen. I can't promise I'll always agree, but I'll listen to your concerns and factor them into my decisions." Clara was quiet for several minutes, weighing risks that all seemed unacceptable. Stay behind and worry about Mac's safety while facing the possibility of another tornado strike. Go with him and experience the terror of approaching a deadly storm system deliberately. Trust a man she'd known for one day with her life and his own. Finally, she turned back to Mac with the expression of determined resignation. "I will come, but not because I want to chase storms, because I do not want to sit here wondering if you will return." Mac felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. For 8 years, he had faced every storm alone, made every dangerous decision in isolation, carried the weight of his research and his guilt as solitary burdens. The prospect of having someone alongside him, someone who cared about his safe return, felt both terrifying and oddly liberating. "We leave in 20 minutes, he said, returning to his equipment preparations with renewed efficiency. "Dress warmly, wear sturdy shoes, and bring water. Storm chasing is mostly waiting and watching, but when things happen, they happen fast." As Clara gathered her few belongings and tried to prepare mentally for what might be the most frightening experience of her life, Mac continued his methodical equipment checks with a new sense of responsibility weighing on his shoulders. He was no longer accountable only for his own safety and the success of his research. He was accountable for the well-being of someone who had trusted him enough to face her fears alongside his. The storm was coming, whether they chased it or not. But for the first time in 3 years, Mac would not be facing it alone. The reinforced pickup truck cut through the Kansas countryside like a missile seeking its target. Every piece of equipment secured and every system tested as Mac navigated toward the growing supercell. Clara gripped the armrests of her seat as they bounced over rough farm roads, the landscape around them taking on an otherworldly quality as the storm's influence spread across the prairie. The air had turned the color of old brass, heavy and electric, with the kind of energy that seemed to crawl along exposed skin. Mac's instruments filled the cab with a constant stream of data, beeping and chirping as atmospheric pressure fluctuated and wind patterns shifted. Through the reinforced windshield, Clara could see the storm wall approaching, a towering mass of cloud that seemed to stretch from Earth to stratosphere. "Temperatures dropping fast," Max said into his headset, reporting. "To the University Coordination Center. Pressure differential is increasing. We're looking at textbook supercell development with strong rotational signatures." Clara watched him work with fascination and terror. His movements were precise and economical, simultaneously monitoring multiple data streams while maintaining control of the vehicle over increasingly treacherous terrain. There was an intensity to his focus that reminded her of surgeons she'd seen working in emergency rooms, the same combination of technical skill and life or death concentration. "How close will we get?" she asked, raising her voice over the sound of hail beginning to strike the truck's armored exterior. Close enough to deploy sensors in the tornado's path, far enough away to maintain escape routes. Mac adjusted their heading slightly, following what appeared to be an invisible map in his mind. "The key is positioning. Too close, and you get caught in the circulation. Too far, and the data isn't useful." The hail intensified. Chunks of ice the size of golf balls hammering against the truck with metallic percussion that made conversation difficult. Clara found herself pressing back into her seat as the storm's fury increased, every primitive instinct screaming at her to find shelter rather than drive deliberately toward the source of the violence. Through the chaos, she began to understand something about Mac that his words hadn't conveyed. This wasn't recklessness or a death wish disguised as scientific inquiry. This was craftsmanship, the application of years of study and experience to a task that required perfect timing and absolute precision. He read the storm's moods like a musician reading sheet music, interpreting subtle changes in wind direction and cloud formation into actionable intelligence. "There," Max said suddenly, pointing through the windshield at what looked to Clara like slightly darker patch in the already ominous sky. "Rotation's beginning. We've got maybe 10 minutes before touchdown." Clara squinted, but couldn't see what Mac was observing. To her untrained eye, the entire storm system looked equally threatening, an undifferentiated mass of destruction bearing down on them with implacable force. But Mac was already making adjustments, positioning the truck on a small rise that provided clear sightlines in multiple directions. "This is our deployment zone," he explained, bringing the vehicle to a stop and beginning to activate additional monitoring equipment. "We'll release the mobile sensors when the tornado forms, then track its movement and intensity from here." Clara looked around at their position, noting how exposed they seemed on the open hillside. "What if it comes toward us?" "Then we leave. Fast." Mac's fingers danced across instrument panels with practiced ease. "That's why we maintain multiple escape routes and keep the engine running at all times." The words were meant to be reassuring, but Clara found herself calculating distances and wondering exactly how fast a tornado could move compared to their truck. The mathematical exercise was interrupted by a sound unlike anything she'd ever heard, a low rumble that seemed to emerge from the earth itself rather than the sky above. "It's forming," Mac said, his voice tight with excitement and concentration. "Clara, look southwest, about 2 miles out. Do you see the funnel?" Clara followed his pointing finger and felt her breath catch. What had been chaotic cloud movement was suddenly organizing itself into something deliberate and terrifying. A dark tendril was extending downward from the storm's base, rotating slowly at first, but gaining speed and definition as it reached toward the ground. "Dios mío," she whispered, watching the tornado take shape with fascination that overcame her fear. It was beautiful in a way that seemed almost obscene, nature's raw power made visible in spiraling columns of destruction. Mac was already in motion, releasing sensor packages from the truck's specialized deployment system. Small parachute-equipped devices scattered across the tornado's projected path, designed to record wind speed, pressure, and temperature as the vortex passed over them. His commentary into the radio headset became rapid and technical, feeding real-time observations to researchers hundreds of miles away. Confirmed touchdown, EF3 intensity based on visual assessment. Forward speed, approximately 25 miles per hour on a northeast heading, deploying full sensor array now. Clara watched the tornado with growing unease as it carved a visible path of destruction across the farmland below them. Buildings disappeared into the vortex, emerging as scattered debris that painted abstract patterns across the landscape. The sound was incredible, a freight train roar mixed with something that seemed almost like screaming. "Mac," she said urgently, "it's getting bigger." He looked up from his instruments and Clara saw his expression change subtly. The tornado was indeed intensifying, its funnel widening and darkening as it consumed more energy from the supercell. Above, more concerning was its path, which seemed to be curving slightly in their direction. "Still within normal parameters," Mac said, but his voice carried less certainty than it had minutes earlier. "These systems often wobble as they develop." Clara continued watching the tornado's movement, trying to apply the mathematical skills that had served her as a teacher to predict its trajectory. The curve wasn't random wobbling, she realized with growing alarm. It was a systematic shift that would bring the vortex directly toward their position. "Mac, it's turning toward us. I see it." His hands were already moving toward the truck's controls, but Clara could sense his internal struggle. The data collection was at a critical phase. The sensors were perfectly positioned, and abandoning the deployment site now would mean losing irreplaceable research opportunities. "We need to leave. Now." 30 more seconds. The sensors are recording incredible data, pressure readings we've never achieved this close to an active vortex. Clara looked between Mac and the approaching tornado, understanding suddenly that she was witnessing the same decision-making process that had cost his research partner's life. The pursuit of perfect data, the reluctance to abandon a successful deployment, the belief that professional expertise could overcome natural unpredictability. "Mac." Her voice was steady but carried absolute authority. "Your partner had 30 more seconds too." The comparison hit Mac like a physical blow. His hands froze on the instruments as Clara's words stripped away the protective layers of scientific rationalization he'd built around his risk-taking behavior. She was right, and he knew it. David had died because he'd prioritized data collection over personal safety, convinced that his expertise would protect him from the chaos he was studying. Mac threw the truck into gear without another word, abandoning the sensor deployment and turning toward their primary escape route. The tornado was less than a mile away now, close enough that they could see individual pieces of debris spinning. Within the vortex, trees, building materials, farm equipment, and unidentifiable objects whirled through the air in a deadly ballet of destruction. The truck's reinforced suspension absorbed the impact of rough terrain as Mac pushed their speed to dangerous levels, racing to stay ahead of the tornado's path. Clara braced herself against the doorframe, watching through the rear window as the vortex continued its relentless advance across the landscape behind them. "It's still following us," she reported, trying to keep panic out of her voice. Mac checked his mirrors and made rapid calculations based on their speed and the tornado's apparent velocity. "It's not following us specifically. Tornadoes don't chase vehicles. But this one's path is coinciding with our escape route." "What does that mean?" "It means we need to get creative." Mac suddenly turned the truck 90 degrees to the left, abandoning the farm road they'd been following for open prairie. The vehicle bounced and lurched over uneven ground, its specialized tires struggling for purchase on grass made slippery by the storm's precipitation. "Where are we going?" "Away from the tornado's projected path. These systems usually maintain fairly straight trajectories once they're established. By moving perpendicular to its course, we should be able to get clear of the danger zone. Clara held on as Mac navigated between fence posts and irrigation ditches, the truck's GPS system providing navigation data while weather instruments continued tracking the storm's movement. Behind them, the tornado maintained its northeastern heading, carving a path of destruction that missed their new position by less than half a mile. They drove in tense silence for several minutes, putting distance between themselves and the active tornado, while Mac monitored radio reports from other research teams. The storm system was producing multiple vortices now. A family of tornadoes spawned from the same supercell that threatened communities across a 50-mile swath of central Kansas. Emergency services are reporting major damage in Clearwater, Mac relayed, listening to his headset. The tornado that nearly got us just destroyed most of the town's business district. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm's temperature drop. People. Unknown casualties at this time. Search and rescue teams are mobilizing, but the storm's still active. They can't begin recovery operations until the system passes completely. The truck crested a small hill, giving them a panoramic view of the storm system's full scope. Multiple tornadoes were visible across the landscape, dark funnels extending from the roiling cloud base like the tentacles of some enormous atmospheric creature. It was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying, nature's power displayed on a scale that reduced human concerns to insignificance. Mac pulled the truck to a stop in a position that offered clear escape routes in multiple directions. "This is far enough for safety, close enough for useful observations," he said, returning his attention to the instrument displays. "We can monitor the system's development from here without risking another close encounter." Clara nodded, still processing the adrenaline rush of their escape. "You do this often? Almost get killed for science?" Mac was quiet for a moment, studying readouts that showed wind speeds, pressure differentials, and rotational velocities from the sensors they'd abandoned. "More often than I should, apparently. Less often than I used to think was necessary." "What changed?" He looked at her directly, and Clara saw something in his expression that went beyond professional reassessment. "Having someone who cares whether I come back alive. Having a reason to prioritize survival over data collection." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to build. Clara realized that their relationship had shifted. During the storm chase, moving from mutual concern to something deeper and more complex. Mac had trusted her judgment enough to abandon his research deployment, and she had trusted his expertise enough to accompany him into mortal danger. "The data you lost," she said, "was it important?" "It would have been valuable. Pressure readings from that close to an active tornado could have improved our understanding of vortex dynamics significantly." Mac shrugged, surprising himself with how little the lost opportunity bothered him. "But there will be other storms, other chances to collect data. There wouldn't have been other chances for us if we'd stayed too long." Clara studied his profile as he monitored the storm's continued development. The intensity she'd observed earlier was still there, but it was tempered now by something that looked like wisdom, or perhaps simply the recognition that some risks weren't worth taking regardless of their potential scientific value. "Your partner," she said carefully, "do you think he would have made the same choice you just made?" Mac considered this seriously. David was brilliant, dedicated, fearless, in the pursuit of knowledge. Those were his greatest strengths and his fatal weakness. He believed that understanding weather systems was worth any personal risk, that individual safety was less important than advancing human knowledge. "And you? What do you believe now?" "I believe that advancing human knowledge requires humans to survive long enough to apply what they've learned. I believe that the best research comes from scientists who care enough about their own lives to exercise good judgment about acceptable risks. Clara smiled at this, recognizing the hard-won wisdom in Mac's words. In Honduras, we have another, saying, El sabio aprende de los errores ajenos, el tonto de los propios. The wise man learns from others' mistakes, the fool from his own. Which category do I fall into? You learned from your partner's mistake eventually. That makes you wise, just a little slow. Mac laughed despite the gravity of their situation, finding humor in Clara's gentle mockery. Around them, the storm system continued its destructive passage across the Kansas landscape, but their immediate danger had passed. They were safe, they were together, and they had both learned something important about the difference between courage and foolishness. The radio crackled with continued reports of tornado damage and emergency response efforts. Communities across 3 counties were assessing destruction, counting casualties, beginning the long process of recovery and rebuilding. Mac and Clara sat in the reinforced truck, surrounded by sophisticated weather monitoring equipment, witnesses to nature's awesome power and human resilience. What happens now? Clara asked, watching the storm system gradually move away toward the northeast. Now we help, Mac said, already plotting a course toward the most severely damaged areas. The data collection phase is over. Time for the humanitarian phase. As Mac started the truck and began driving toward Clearwater, Clara realized that the storm chase had changed more than just their understanding of acceptable risk. It had shown them both something about their capacity to care for each other, to make decisions based on shared concern rather than individual priorities. They had faced the storm together and emerged stronger, more connected, more committed to a future that neither had planned, but both were beginning to want. The town of Clearwater looked like it had been erased by an enormous pencil, leaving only scattered fragments where buildings had stood hours earlier. Mac navigated the reinforced truck carefully through streets blocked by debris, past emergency vehicles and search teams, working methodically through the wreckage. Clara pressed her face to the window, overwhelmed by the scope of destruction that made the previous night's damage to Millfield seem minor by comparison. How many people lived here? She asked, watching rescue workers carefully lift pieces of what had been someone's roof. About 800. Small farming community, been here since the 1890s. Mac parked near what remained of the volunteer fire station, where Incident Command had established a coordination center. Most folks would have had warning, gotten to shelter. But in storms, this intense, even good preparation doesn't guarantee survival. They climbed out of the truck into air thick with dust and the acrid smell of natural gas from ruptured lines. Emergency personnel moved with practiced efficiency, their bright vests creating islands of organized activity in the chaos. Mac approached the incident commander, a weathered man in his 50s, whose uniform identified him as Sheriff Coleman from the county seat. Dr. Holloway, Kansas State University Weather Research, Mac introduced himself. This is Clara Reyes. We're tracking the storm system that hit you. Anything we can do to help? Coleman looked them over, taking in Mac's specialized equipment and Clara's obvious foreign origins with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to managing disasters. You medical trained? I have emergency medical certification, Mackie replied. Part of my field research requirements. Good enough. We've got more injured than we can handle, and the nearest hospital's 40 miles away. Coleman gestured toward a makeshift triage area set up in the parking lot of what had been the town's only grocery store. Dr. Patterson's working alone. Over there could use another pair of trained hands. Mac nodded and began gathering medical supplies from his truck's emergency kit. Clara followed, uncertain what assistance she could provide, but unwilling to remain idle while people needed help. The triage area was a study in organized chaos, with patients arranged according to injury severity on blankets and improvised stretchers. Dr. Patterson, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and hands that moved with surgical precision, looked up as they approached. "You the weather people." "Dr. Marcus Holloway, this is Clara Reyes. Sheriff Coleman said you needed help. Can you handle wound cleaning and basic suturing?" "Yes." "Good. I've got 3 people who need immediate surgery, another dozen with injuries that require professional attention, and about 30 walking wounded who need basic care." Dr. Patterson handed Mac a medical kit. "Start with the moderate injuries. Work your way through the list. Anything that looks complicated, call me over." Mac set up a treatment station using supplies from his truck and materials scavenged from the destroyed buildings. Clara watched him work on the first patient, a middle-aged farmer with glass cuts covering his arms and face. Mac's movements were confident and gentle, cleaning wounds with careful attention to detail while maintaining steady conversation to keep the man calm. "You've done this before," Clara observed, handing Mac sterile gauze without being asked. "Field research takes you to remote locations. Sometimes you're the only medical help available for miles." Mac finished bandaging the farmer's arm and made notes on a makeshift chart. "What about you? Any medical experience?" "I helped at a clinic in Honduras during my teaching certification. Basic wound care, patient comfort, translation services." Clara moved to organize supplies with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making order from chaos. "I can assist if you show me what you need." They worked together for the next 4 hours as afternoon faded into evening. Clara proved to be an excellent assistant, anticipating Mac's needs and providing calm reassurance to patients who spoke little English. Her natural warmth and gentle manner seemed to ease pain in ways that medical supplies couldn't address. Between patients, Mac found himself watching Clara interact with injured children, elderly residents, and traumatized families. She had a gift for making connections across language barriers, using a combination of broken English, expressive gestures, and genuine compassion to communicate care and concern. With Spanish-speaking workers from area farms, she served as translator, helping Dr. Patterson understand symptoms and explain treatment procedures. "Where did you learn to do this?" Mac asked during a brief break, watching Clara comfort a young mother whose toddler had been treated for minor cuts. "My grandmother. She was what you might call a neighborhood healer, someone people came to when they couldn't afford doctors or when medical care wasn't available. She taught me that healing isn't just about treating injuries, it's about treating the whole person, including their fear and confusion." Mac nodded, understanding something new about Clara's background and capabilities. "You're good at this, better than good. So are you. Different from chasing storms, but the same careful attention to detail, the same focus on helping people." As evening settled over the disaster area, emergency services began transitioning from rescue operations to recovery efforts. The immediate medical crisis had been managed, though the long-term challenges of rebuilding and healing were just beginning. Mac and Clara helped pack up the triage station, exhausted but satisfied with their contribution to the community's response. Sheriff Coleman approached as they finished loading supplies. "Wanted to thank you both. Made a real difference having extra medical help available." "Glad we could assist," Mac replied. "What's the assessment for casualties?" "Better than it could have been. 12 people hospitalized, no confirmed fatalities, though we're still searching through some of the worst damage areas." Coleman's expression was grim but relieved. "Community's going to need a lot of help rebuilding, but at least we didn't lose anyone we can't replace." Mac and Clara drove back toward his trailer in comfortable silence, both processing the day's experiences. The sunset painted the Kansas sky in brilliant oranges and purples, nature's beauty returning after the morning's violence. The landscape they passed showed scattered evidence of the storm's passage, but also signs of human resilience as people began the work of cleaning up and moving forward. "Thank you," Clara said as they turned onto the dirt road leading to Mac's property. "For what?" "For listening when I told you to leave the storm, for including me in something that mattered, for showing me what it looks like when someone uses their skills to help others, instead of just pursuing personal goals." Mac considered this as he parked the truck beside his trailer. The structure had weathered the day's storms without damage, its reinforced construction and strategic positioning having protected it from the worst of the atmospheric violence. But returning to it felt different now, less like retreating to isolation and more like coming home to a base of operations for future endeavors. "I should be thanking you," he said, "for keeping me from making David's mistake, for helping me. Remember that research is supposed to serve human needs, not the other way around." They entered the trailer together, both exhausted from the day's physical and emotional demands. Clara moved automatically to the kitchen area, beginning to prepare a simple meal from Mac's limited supplies. Mac settled at his weather station, checking on storm systems across the region, but his attention kept drifting to Clara's movements as she worked. "The tornado that hit Clearwater," Clara said while stirring pasta sauce. "It was stronger than the one that destroyed Victor's ranch. Be much stronger. EF4, sustained winds over 200 miles per hour. The one last night was probably EF2, maybe EF3 at its peak." Mac pulled up satellite images showing both storm systems. Clearwater was hit by one of the most powerful tornadoes recorded in Kansas this decade, and people survived because they had warning, because they knew what to do. Exactly. Better forecasting, improved emergency communications, stronger building codes, community preparedness programs. All the things that come from understanding severe weather better. Clara brought 2 plates to Mac's small table, settling across from him with a thoughtful expression. "So your research, it really does save lives. Not just the data collection, but the whole process of studying storms and teaching people how to respond to them." "That's the theory. Whether my specific contributions make a meaningful difference, that's harder to measure." Clara reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers warm and steady against his palm. Today made a difference. Not just the medical help, but the choice to help instead of chasing more data. That made a difference to me and to everyone we treated. Mac looked down at their joined hands, struck by how natural the contact felt, despite their brief acquaintance. "What happens now, Clara? Your situation hasn't really changed. Victor's still married. You still don't have documentation for permanent residency. You still need to figure out how to build a life here." Clara was quiet for several minutes, considering possibilities that had seemed impossible just days earlier. "I've been thinking about that, about what you said yesterday, about having years to start over, to work toward teaching certification. And I think maybe I don't want to just rebuild my old life in a new place. Maybe I want to build something completely different. Something I never would have attempted if circumstances hadn't forced me to reconsider everything." Mac waited, sensing that Clara was working through ideas that went beyond immediate survival concerns. "What if I stayed here, not permanently, not as your responsibility, but as someone building her own future while learning what that future might look like?" Clara's voice grew stronger as she articulated her thoughts. "I could work on my English, study for teaching certification, maybe help with disaster relief efforts, while I figure out the legal requirements for residency. You'd want to stay in Kansas after everything that's happened?" Clara smiled, gesturing toward the window, where the sunset was painting the prairie in golden light. "Kansas brought me tornadoes and lies and destruction, but it also brought me someone who risks his life to understand storms so other people can survive them. Someone who gives shelter to strangers and medicine to the injured, and who listens when someone tells him he's being reckless. Mac felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness that he hadn't experienced since before David's death. You could stay as long as you want. This trailer's designed for one person, but it could accommodate two people who don't mind sharing space. And your research? Your need to work alone to avoid being responsible for someone else's safety? Maybe I was wrong about needing to work alone. Maybe the right kind of partnership makes the work better, not more dangerous. Max squeezed Clara's hand gently. Today proved that we make good decisions together, that we can help each other without interfering with each other's judgment. Clara leaned forward, studying Mac's face in the soft light from his equipment displays. Are you asking me to become your research partner? I'm asking you to become whatever you want to become, while staying close enough that we can figure out what this is between us. Mac gestured to encompass not just their physical proximity, but the emotional connection that had developed through shared crisis and mutual care. I'm asking you to help me learn how to be someone who chases storms for the right reasons. Clara stood and moved around the table, settling beside Mac on the built-in bench. When she kissed him, it was with the same deliberate care she'd shown while assisting with medical treatment, gentle but purposeful, conveying warmth and commitment without demanding more than the moment could support. I will stay, she said quietly, her forehead resting against his. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I want to see what we can build together, not just between us, but in the world around us. Mac wrapped his arms around Clara, feeling her warmth and steadiness anchor him in ways that all his sophisticated weather instruments never could. Outside, the Kansas wind whispered across the prairie, carrying the sense of rain and growing things and the promise of storms to come. But inside the reinforced trailer, two people who had been broken by different disasters were beginning the careful work of healing, both individually and together. Over the following weeks, they developed new rhythms that accommodated both Mac's research schedule and Clara's language studies. She accompanied him on storm deployments, serving as safety observer and medical support while learning to read weather patterns with increasing sophistication. He helped her navigate immigration paperwork and teacher certification requirements, discovering that his university connections could open doors that might otherwise remain closed to someone in Clara's situation. The trailer gradually transformed from a lonely outpost into a genuine home, filled with Clara's cooking aromas and the sound of her voice practicing English pronunciation. Mac's colleagues began to notice changes in his approach to field research, a newfound caution that improved, rather than hindered his data collection efforts. Clara's presence provided not just safety monitoring, but emotional grounding that allowed Mac to take intelligent risks rather than desperate ones. By summer's end, Clara had passed her English proficiency examinations and begun substitute teaching at Millfield's rebuilt elementary school. Mac had published research papers based on data collected during their joint storm deployments, work that was acclaimed for its innovative safety protocols and comprehensive disaster response integration. Together, they had responded to 7 major weather events, providing emergency medical assistance and scientific documentation while never losing sight of their primary commitment to each other's well-being. One evening in late August, as they sat on the trailer's small porch watching thunderheads build on the western horizon, Clara rested her head against Mac's shoulder and spoke the words that had been growing between them for months. "Te amo," she said simply. "I love you." Mac turned to look at her, seeing in her dark eyes the reflection of lightning that flickered within the distant storm clouds. "I love you too," he replied, "completely, carefully, and for as long as you'll have me." The storm approached slowly, giving them time to secure equipment and prepare for whatever intensity the night might bring. But they faced it together, as they had learned to face everything together, with mutual trust and shared purpose, and the knowledge that some forces of nature were meant to be weathered in partnership rather than endured alone. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.